All right, at this point, we are officially done with the healing process, and we are ready to selectively modify the luminance levels using the dodge and burn tools. Now, they're pretty straightforward. You paint with the dodge tool in order to selectively brighten the image, and you paint with the burn tool in order to selectively darken it. And that will allow us to, for example, brighten up the eyes, as we're seeing in this final version of the image, although it's entirely possible that I won't go quite this far. All right, so I'll go and switch over to my image at hand. Now, the thing about the dodge and burn tools, which are these guys right here, the dodge tool looks like a little paddle, and the burn tool looks like a little hand. They each have keyboard shortcuts of O for tone, because these are the so-called tone tools. The thing is, they're destructive painting tools. They modify the actual pixels inside the image, which means that we need to go ahead and fuse everything we've done so far onto a new layer. And you do that using a variation on a command that's available down here at the bottom of the layer menu. Notice this command here, merge visible. It has a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-E or Command-Shift-E on the Mac. The problem is, if we were to choose that command, I would merge everything that we've done so far onto a single flat background, which is not ideal because, after all, then we lose all of our layers. So I'll go ahead and press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that change. If you want to merge everything onto a new layer, then you have to add the Alt or Option key to that keyboard shortcut. So in other words, you press what I call Mash Your Fist E. That is to say, all the modifier keys, so Control-Shift-Alt here on the PC or Command-Shift-Option on the Mac, E. And I know there's a handful of folks out there who really get tired of the keyboard shortcut. Some people love them. Most people do, in my experience, but some people don't. Problem is, this keyboard shortcut I just told you, Control-Shift-Alt-E or Command-Shift-Option-E on the Mac, is the only way to make things happen. There is no command associated with this function. So you just go ahead and mash your fist E in order to merge everything onto a new layer, and then you double-click on its name and rename it Merged, let's say. All right, now, armed with the dodge tool, I'll go ahead and press the right bracket key a few times in order to increase the size of my brush, and then I'll paint over each of the left-hand girl's eyes. And if you want to brighten things further, then just go ahead and paint over the eyes again, although if you ask me, that's too much. So I'll just go ahead and press Control-Alt-Z or Command-Option-Z a couple of times in a row in order to backstep, and then I'll modify my exposure value, which you can do from the keyboard just by tapping a number key. So for example, if I tap the 2 key, I'll reduce the exposure to 20%, and then I'll just go ahead and paint over each of those eyes again. All right, now I'll press the 5 key to restore an exposure value of 50%, and I'll go ahead and paint over each of the right-hand girl's eyes as well. Now, you may notice a small problem here. I've gone and painted way outside of the eyes. So I've brightened not only the eyes, but the eyelids as well. Obviously, we don't want that, which is why it's so fortunate that you can selectively erase modifications using this thing called the History brush. And here's how it works. You want to go up to the Window menu and choose the History command, and that'll bring up the History panel. Now, I went ahead and closed my image and reopened it under a different name, which is why I have so few states. But notice this little guy right there, this little brush with a revolving arrow around it. That tells you the source state for the History brush. You want it to be the state right before you use the dodge tool. And to make that happen, go ahead and click in front of that item right there called Name Change, ostensibly, if you've been working along with me. And now what you can do is switch to the History brush, which is this guy right here. It's a great, underrated tool. And what it lets you do is just paint back to the way things were at that state. So it looks just like the little icon right there. The tool does, that is. And now I'll just go ahead and increase the size of my cursor a little bit by pressing the right bracket key. And I'll paint over this top eyelid, and then I'll paint on the bottom eyelid as well. And as you can see, that allows me to paint back in the unmodified eyelids, which is a very good thing. Now, the girl on the right doesn't exhibit quite the same degree of bright eyelids, but it's worth painting around her eyes as well. All right, now I'll just go ahead and zoom back out so that I can see more of the image. And I'll go ahead and hide my History panel as well. All right, now let's try out the burn tool. I'll go ahead and click and hold on the dodge tool icon and select the burn tool from the flyout menu. And these characters don't really need that much burning, but I suppose what you could do is darken up the top eyelid like so, although that's way too much. So I'll press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that change. And I'll press the 2 key to take the exposure value up here in the options bar down to 20%. And then I'll paint over each of the top eyelids for both girls. And I'm also going to paint in this spot of hair in a right-hand girl's head, just to darken things up so the scalp looks a little more consistent. All right, now the last thing I want to do in this movie is just increase the contrast a little bit, specifically inside the faces. So I'm going to go ahead and switch from the burn tool to the dodge tool. And then I'll increase the heck out of my cursor. I'm taking it up to 2,500 pixels, as you can see here. And if I were to right-click inside the image window, you'd see that the size is 2,500 pixels. And by default, the hardness value is 0% when you're using the dodge and burn tools, which is typically a good thing. All right, I'll go ahead and press the escape key in order to hide that panel. And instead of brightening the midtones inside the image, I'm going to brighten the highlights. That way I can increase the contrast. The exposure value is 50%, as you can see here. And so I'll just try clicking inside the image, and that gives us way too much color. So I'll press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac, and I'll press the 2 key to reduce the exposure key to 20%. I'm just trying things out here. And then I'll click on the left-hand girl's face, and now I'll click on the right-hand girl's face. And that way, we're just brightening up both of their countenances. We're keeping the shadows as dark as they ever would, and as a result, we're increasing the contrast of the most important details inside of this photograph, which are the faces themselves. And that's how you take advantage of the dodge and burn tools inside of Photoshop. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, after all this brightening, why didn't you deal with the teeth? And the reason for that is that's exactly what I am going to do in the next movie.